So apologies, everybody. I don't usually have issues with with technology. Okay, so the presentation today, which I'm going to have to work out some bits to cut because of the lost time, is, I guess, sort of a work in progress, and it's partly going to be about the method, because I think it's an interesting method, but we've had some challenges with it. And so that's partly what it's going to be about, and partly it'll be reporting some of the results of this research that we've been doing. So this is a research project that received a little bit of internal funding over the 2020 period to undertake more or less a pilot looking at the question of the African diaspora in Australia and what their ongoing transnational political, economic and sociocultural engagements are. And you can see the names of the people who were associated with this project. There's David Mickler from political science and Sarah Prout-Quick from geography here, and Dominic Dagbanja from law. So these are UWA people. Mohammed Dun Sulaiman was the research assistant on the project. And then we had Mary Satrana from the University of Ghana, who heads up one of the migration research institutes there, and Bernadette Masbai, who is from the Office of Multicultural Affairs, Multicultural Interests here in Western Australia. So it was a project that was trying to, and we also had someone from a Kenyan university as well, but he wasn't able to continue. So these are the people who continued in the study. Okay, so just a bit of background about, I guess, what prompted the research question. The African Union a number of years ago designated the global African diaspora as the 6th region of Africa. Africa is divided into 5 regions, and then the African Union, wanting to engage, particularly in terms of kind of development projects, etc., wanting to engage the diaspora across the world, designated the diaspora the 6th region of Africa. The research that has occurred to date in Australia, there's a lot of research about Africans settling in Australia, even though they're a very, very small percentage of the population. I'll show you some figures shortly. The research has predominantly been about those who've arrived as humanitarian entrants, so people of refugee backgrounds, and particularly people of South Sudanese background. The research, as well as the political discourse, has tended to have a homogenizing effect, not recognising the diversity of migrants from the African continent to Australia, and has also tended to be negative, even where it's not meaning to take a kind of a pathological sort of approach. There has been a pathologizing tendency among the research, focusing on the problems of settlement of some of the, particularly the humanitarian entrants, often from South Sudanese backgrounds. So this Research Collaboration Award, which was an internally funded research grant, was looking at the actual and potential transnational contributions of the African Australian diaspora to, as I said, socio-economic, political and cultural landscapes of both the home and the host region. So we're interested in this kind of transnational engagements and the sorts of exchanges, relationships, borrowings, lendings, etc., across distance. We used an innovative technique, which is what I'm going to be talking more about shortly, called the Delphi technique, which is an approach where rather than interviewing people or conducting focus groups or sending out questionnaires, you undertake a collaborative consensus building process with academic and policy experts from, and in this case it was from Africa and Australia. So first of all, I just want to kind of discuss very briefly what we mean when we use the term diaspora. There's all sorts of literature around what diaspora means. There's a journal called Diaspora Studies. So a couple of definitions, one from McIntyre and Gamlin. Diasporas are dispersed migrant populations that retain a shared group of shared group identity and orientation towards a distant homeland. So this idea of migrants who see themselves somehow as a collective oriented towards a distant homeland. And I think it's kind of interesting trying to apply this definition to a continent rather than to, usually it's applied to a nation, to people who've come from a single nation. What's interesting about the ways in which diaspora is being conceptualized currently, particularly in the political sphere by governments, is that diasporas are seen as a resource. And so you see the African Union actually kind of defining the African diaspora as part of Africa. So we've moved away from diasporas being seen as a boundary eroding phenomenon to being seen as a boundary expanding phenomenon. And this Gamlin has talked about a form of dispersed belonging defined by nation states rather than in opposition to them. There are, again, to this end, in terms of governments trying to engage their diasporas, there are origin state diasporic institutions in over half the world's countries. So this is now kind of a thing where origin states that have large immigrant populations who have left, try to kind of reclaim them in various ways or engage them in various ways through these diasporic institutions. Gamlin has talked about three functions of diasporas and calls these a form of kind of human geopolitics, where diasporas are tapped for their resources in terms of sending remittances home, for example, embraced for identity projects to expand a positive sense of national identity, and as leverage to govern in terms of opportunities for kind of political projects that extend beyond national boundaries. And that latter function is becoming more and more important. So the African Union's definition of diaspora is that it refers to the peoples of African origin living outside the continent, irrespective of their citizenship and nationality, and who are willing to contribute to the development of the continent and the building of the African Union. So you see that it has sort of both this sort of instrumental and an affective kind of element to it. It's about developing an identity that extends beyond the country and region of origin, as well as being available to be tapped for development potential. Okay, so just on the screen there we've been working on a couple of papers. One is this one that Sarah, David and myself have been writing on Are Africans in Australia Diaspora? And we've used these dot points, which basically come out of the literature, to define what diasporas are. And then we've kind of looked at the features of the African population in Australia against those characteristics to kind of tease out an answer to that question. And I've also just done a literature review, basically, of the research that has been done in Australia on Black Africans in Australia, which is just out in International Migration. Okay, so in terms of this kind of recognition by governments that diasporas can be important, so they've not only been recognised by the home countries, but also by the countries that they have migrated to. So in terms of the African diaspora in Australia, the Australian Foreign Ministers Advisory Group on Australia-Africa Relations has produced a document called A Strategy for Australia's Engagement with Africa. And in that, it recognises that the African diaspora are an important source of people-to-people ties, and suggests that the government should be looking to international examples where host governments have kind of been able to use the diaspora communities in structured ways, leading development programs, for example, in countries of origin, or volunteering programs, and in peace building and reconciliation type projects. In a 2021 Senate report, there has been an emphasis on the value of diasporas in terms of intergovernmental dialogue, and that they can be useful to the government in a range of different ways. So you can see in these a sort of a changing construction of the African diaspora, less as a burden on the Australian economy, a group that needs our help and our services, but as a group of people who can be leveraged for instrumental ends. Okay, so who are these people that we've been talking about? The Africans in Australia, and thank you to Sarah Prout-Quick, who has constructed this diagram, which has come. It's a graph which extends. There was an earlier graph from Graham Hugo, and this is a more recent one, updating the sources as well as the extent of African migration to Australia. And you can see that in the last 20 years or so, there's been an exponential rise in the numbers of Africans or people of African birth living in Australia, but these are predominantly from South Africa. So you've got this very big orange chunk there from South Africa. Previously, there had been kind of a large chunk from Egypt, but this is quite stable. And then that larger grey increase is a combination of people of humanitarian entrant backgrounds, and also people who are coming under the skills stream. So 2.6% of the Australian population were either born in Africa themselves or have a parent, at least one parent born in Africa. But as you can see from the figures here, if you combine South Africa and Zimbabwe on the assumption that most of those migrants are white South Africans, you can see that about half of the population are not Black Africans, but half are. Okay, so a little bit more about the research project. A collaborative effort between academic, policy and practitioner experts from Africa and Australia, looking at the drivers and impacts of growing African-Australian diasporic activity using the Delphi technique. And we've just, some of us have put together a discovery project application, which is, we should be getting some feedback on probably in the next 2 months or so. So what is the Delphi technique? So the Delphi technique is an approach where you have a facilitator or researcher, group of researchers who bring together a group of experts, and these experts can be broadly defined. So they might be academic experts, they might be medical experts, they might be policy experts, they might be people with lived experience of the sort of thing that you're interested in. You bring them together and you request their feedback, and you co-construct a document, usually through 3 rounds or so, where through an iterative process where people provide feedback on the document, things they agree with, things they disagree with. You take special care to look at kind of outliers, people who are saying something different from what the bulk of your respondents are saying, until there is a consensus, and then you produce a final report. So we thought this would be an interesting technique to use in this particular study. Okay, so we also, within this, we were interested in Kenya and Ghana as case studies, and I'll talk a little bit more about those shortly. We invited 132 potential experts to participate, and 38 agreed, and responses from round 1, we only had 21 people who actually responded. For round 2, we only had 5 people, so we kind of stopped it at that point. So for round 2, we constructed for round 1, we provided a 4 or 5 page summary of the literature that existed on transnational engagements between Australia and Africa, and kind of asked some questions around the sorts of things that we were interested in, and asked people to respond to kind of the literature review and the questions, the associated questions. We then collated their responses put together 16 pages of kind of extended summary and recommendations, and condensed out of that a one-page executive summary of the results. And we highlighted certain areas where we hoped that we would get more information from the participants, and asked them to respond. In the analysis, we were interested in looking at micro, meso and macro level engagements, transnational engagements, so at the interpersonal, at the kind of organisational level, as well as at the governmental levels, and political, economic and socio-cultural engagements. Some or most Delphi techniques attempt to quantify the results, and I'll show you a couple of examples shortly. But we did not attempt to do that for a range of reasons. So I think I might kind of skip over this slide, but just to say that it was serendipitous that this was the research design that we had applied for money for in 2019, and it worked perfectly in the COVID year of lockdown, where you couldn't conduct focus groups or face-to-face interviews, for example. Okay, so in the interest of kind of getting on to the actual findings, I'll skip over this one as well. Okay, so these are I just included a couple of examples from other research, just to show you how scientists use this technique. So usually this technique has been used by people in the medical sciences, the health sciences, and here is an example. Actually, both of the examples are from the health sciences. And if you just sort of cast your eyes over the abstract, you can see that their research question is looking at what is the most appropriate aphasia treatment. So aphasia is where you lose your ability to speak after having a stroke. So you can have a look and see the sorts of people that they included as their experts, so clinicians and managers across the world. And they asked an open-ended question to start with. So we started with a kind of a lit review and 5 or 6 different questions. They started with a single open-ended question. In your opinion, what are the most important outcomes or results from aphasia treatment? And then they collated those results, sort of looking thematically at what respondents had said. And then they got participants to kind of vote on which they felt were the most important outcomes. So I'm just showing you this not because it's relevant to our particular approach, but that this is a more formal Delphi technique. And here's another example. And the thing that I wanted to point out from this example, again, you've got 141 these were behaviours. So I don't know what the N was for this, the number of participants. But they wanted to ensure that they had 75% agreement. So people were able to kind of give some sort of a rating on these quantified responses that they were asked to give. And if more than 75% of the experts agreed with that, then that made it into the final report. Whereas for ours, we're using a much more qualitative approach, and you'll see that from the sorts of responses that we've got. Okay, so moving on, I'm just going to talk briefly about the political themes and the economic themes in our responses, and then very, very briefly about the socio-economic themes, because we've got hundreds of pages of responses, so there's a lot of information in them. So in terms of political themes, people saw important aspects of transnational engagement around citizenship and voting rights, the importance of African countries allowing them to retain their citizenship, to have dual citizenship, and the ways in which some countries were encouraging the diaspora to maintain voting in elections back home. Issues around migration policy, so around the challenges experienced by some of the restrictions in Australian migration policy, the role of African governments in terms of engaging their diaspora in various ways, and the converse of that, the role of the Australian government in engagements. African diasporic activities in Australia, and these included a lot of the work of non-government organisations, community organisations, semi-political organisations within Australia, and there's a proliferation of these. And then political dimensions of African diasporic identity. And there's a lot of crossover. You know, people don't stay in the boxes that we like to try to get them to stay into. So when people were talking about sociocultural elements, they would often also talk about kind of political and economic elements of their engagement. So these didn't separate out neatly into the categories that we thought they might. So most African migrants have some form of political engagement with their African homelands, but their expression differs considerably. Some are very active. It was suggested that refugees, minorities and other persecuted groups might have a stronger interest in maintaining their political advocacy in terms of their homeland. So advocating and organising for action on issues such as human rights and crisis responses, campaigning and fundraising for home country political parties and even armed political groups. These were examples that were given as part of the Delphi. Running for public office themselves and joining diaspora-based community organisations. However, it was also noted that some simply wanted to kind of leave politics behind and move on with their lives in the new country. There were a range of responses around formal political influence from countries of origin. For example, here's a quote from one of the participants who said various countries in Africa also engage their citizens in the diaspora in order to court their support for the development of their respective countries. Ghana, for example, has established a diaspora affairs desk at its High Commission in Canberra to help champion the course of the diaspora community by registering them first and mainstreaming them into the country's development agenda. Here's an example of the intersection of politics, sociocultural and identity issues. One of the participants said most Africans and Kenyans in particular maintain strong connections with their families and friends back home, and many of them make at least annual trips to visit family. Social media and emerging communication tools have provided platforms for Kenyans abroad to not only keep in touch with families, but also to keep up with and participate in socio-political debates and cultural trends back home. Thus, while Australia is home for those Kenyans, they also remain deeply connected in many ways to their roots and identity, and most aspire to return to Kenya one day. And another respondent said, many Africans also bond over discussions around governance, the state of the economy and the political environment back home. Community events that focus on bringing Africans together solidify that sense of identity for Africans collectively and for African migrants from different countries. So I think it's, the content of what people are saying is interesting, but also the manner in which people are responding is interesting. That they're recognising that this is a platform for them to share kind of their own understandings, their own observations, and they share it in an almost kind of academic way. And because it's written, it's not like interview transcript, right? And in fact, a couple of them actually provided references and almost wrote what would look like an academic paper in response to our question. So that was quite interesting. Okay, so in terms of the benefits of transnational political engagement, people felt that it was useful because it increases awareness and knowledge of the political issues going on in Africa among the Australian public more generally. That also they can, the diaspora can kind of keep home governments accountable, and particularly they also felt if the Australian government kind of pays attention to some of these issues, and if they can get the ear of the Australian government on these issues. It also allows what they called risky political action or discourse that would otherwise be impossible at home. And this is a quote from someone, political activists in the diaspora take political cover in Australia and continue to engage in political activities remotely without the risk of being arrested or threatened by authorities. They also talked about political and values transfers. You can read that yourselves. It sort of feels, I tend to cringe a little bit when people talk about how they can convey ideals of social justice and human rights and democratic participation learned in Australia to counterparts in Africa, but that's one of the things that people talked about and identified. Involvement in business and investment in Africa was seen as kind of facilitated through some of these political connections as well, and important for promoting economic growth. Okay, and return migrants were also seen as particularly important, particularly, for example, students who had come to Australia to study and then gone back to work in government institutions back home, and lecturing at universities, etc., and working in private industries such as mining. These were seen as kind of contributions. So again, you see the crossover between kind of the political and the economic there. However, they also identified a number of challenges, including polarisation along political lines, so bringing political dissension from the country of origin or region of origin to Australia, and that this affects the ability of diaspora organisations or institutions to work successfully and to be inclusive. It may also affect the individuals here's support for political and development initiatives back home, kind of depending on whether they're run by the political party that they are supportive of. Tensions, between those in the home countries and the host countries in terms of positions of power were identified as playing out here. Also feelings of pressure to support the country of origin in various political and economic ways, and the uncoordinated and ad hoc nature of diaspora activity in Australia was identified as holding back the potential to actually influence the political agenda here in Australia. In terms of recommendations or suggestions, in terms of improving political transnational engagement, the suggestions were around commitment of greater resources and improving organisational structures. Many mentioned the diaspora desks that some home countries had in host countries, which were seen as of use to engage diasporas. Recommendations to reduce administrative burdens, for example, on gaining dual citizenship, on voting, on being able to pay remittances. They wanted more visible engagement, so senior governments, government officials visiting Australia, promotion of major national celebrations such as Independence Day, and support for cultural programs, including programs for second and third generation diaspora members. Okay, in terms of economic themes, I guess not surprisingly, one of the key ones was around remittances, but what I found interesting was that people talked also about reverse remittances, so not just money going from Australia back to countries in Africa, but also things coming back, which is the next slide. There was divided opinion about whether remittances were good or bad, just as there were about whether there's a brain drain or not, which is a couple of slides from now. So remittances were seen as insurance for the family left behind and as positive because they support housing, the development of businesses, payment for everyday expenses, hospital bills, marriages and funerals, etc. Allow other family members, etc. to migrate, support hometown associations and development. But they were also seen as negative in terms of enhancing inequalities among the people back home. The term laziness was used, sort of encouraging laziness by just being kind of sent money, reinforcing a sense of obligation between the people left behind and the people here, and generating tension between family members about the levels of support they were receiving. The lack of infrastructure and exploitation was also identified, where some people were had difficulty actually with the infrastructure available to send money back home, and getting ripped off as part of that. And you can have a look at that quote yourselves. Reverse remittances included money being sent for people who were having difficulty surviving in the Australian economic context, but also other materials. So here's a quote. They feel an ongoing connection to the African continent through what is called in the literature as reverse remittances, where family members back home send them items like local foods, clothes, traditional medicines, etc. Also, some of them with specialised skills are invited or called upon to contribute to our developmental programs as and when they are needed. So there's this sort of two-way, this idea that remittances go both ways. So this notion of the brain drain, which is another economic impact, I guess. Here's a quote from one of the people who agreed that there was a brain drain, basically giving evidence that there are estimates that in the health sector alone, the continent loses $2 billion annually. Many countries have invested in training medical professionals for them to leave. Similar outcomes have been calculated for the public service, education and construction. Skilled labour is really important for Africa, for sustainable development. On the other hand, people argued that Africa does not have a human resource problem. It is a leadership and failed systems issue. So, so it's around how these human resources are distributed within Africa. And secondly, that it's not a brain drain when individuals have paid their own school fees and the home country may have benefited through their national service, 3 years of work experience, etc. So there were these competing arguments. No consensus was reached on that one. There were a range of suggestions of strategies to compensate. And they made the point that there is a lot of kind of return migration, and those returnees balance out the brain drain, bringing back the experience and the knowledge that they have gained living in Australia. There were a range of other economic transnational features that were discussed. People talked about trade and economic agreements, business investment, which encourage opportunities, local opportunities for employment, importation of goods from Africa to Australia, foreign direct investment, consular services for welfare projects, trade and tourism, promotion, etc., international business collaborations, diaspora bonds and investment by African governments to their diasporic communities in Australia. So there were lots of examples of these ongoing economic relations. Benefits were seen as increased employment in both countries, boost to trade, investment, tourism, skills and knowledge transfers, education, scholarship and exchange, and research collaborations. Okay, there were also identified a range of blockages, including lack of infrastructure, corruption, lack of skills, and the cost of these ongoing engagements. Okay, there were a whole lot of responses around social, cultural, and identity issues, which would make up a separate paper, a separate presentation. I hoped that I would have time to get to them, but because we lost 10 minutes with the technology issues at the start, I won't go into those, and perhaps we'll give another seminar later focusing on those. participants made a number of recommendations, and we are still refining these. The response in the second round to the recommendations was that they need to be very concrete, that at the moment they're quite kind of general. But recommendations to industry in terms of, this was mainly to industry in Australia, to encourage more visibility of those of African backgrounds and educating the wider population about the value of diversity in the workplace, etc. To the Australian government, people felt that we needed to get much more serious about anti-racism education generally, and about encouraging engagements, economic engagements, etc., through appropriate infrastructure. So that's what most of the recommendations are around, infrastructure. I'm not going to have time to go through these. What I do want to finish on, just in the last 2 minutes, and then we'll have a bit of time for questions, is some of the challenges of the Delphi method. So, and I'll just run through these quickly. In the responses, people talked in a very general sort of way about the sorts of issues, but there was a lack of detail. So in the second round, we asked people specifically for examples and detail, but we only got 4 responses. So yeah, it's not a format where you can probe people and ask them to clarify. You basically, you get what they give you. The lack of range of participants. So when we had identified the range of people who we thought might be interested to participate in the research, we'd included academics, we'd included policymakers, we'd included people on the continent, people in Australia, and also people internationally who were working on issues around diaspora and African diaspora particularly. We included NGOs, we included service providers, a whole range of different participants. But it depends on who self-selects into actually participating. And so we ended up with kind of a limited group of participants. So in terms of the people we had in the first round, 11 were from Ghana or were Ghanaians. So that was quite an overrepresentation of Ghanaians, 3 from Kenya. 11 were from the university sector, 4 from NGO or community development type organisations, and 5 from government. So it's not, I mean, it was never going to be a representative sample, but yeah, there were certainly gaps in terms of participants. Range of quality of responses. So some people gave really in-depth and detail and reference responses, and other people just gave a very short personal opinion. The novelty of the method meant that we had to kind of educate people about what it was about. And yeah, people may not be used to qualitative research to start with, let alone this particular type of research. A requirement for literacy may have excluded some people. Maintaining people's interest was obviously an issue. We discussed the question of incentive, whether we might get more people to participate by offering some sort of incentive, and we had a big debate about this. And in the end, we decided to offer people the opportunity to perhaps collaborate on future research, and perhaps even to be named in publications as a form of incentive. I think a fundamental problem with it is that it's sort of trying to combine contradictory paradigms. So you lose some of the richness of the interview, of the data that you would get in interviews, and with this need to generalise, which goes back to the first dot point, the lack of detail. But we also didn't feel it appropriate to ask people to kind of quantify their responses. So we sort of got the worst of both worlds in some ways. So breadth of topics, lots of different interesting things that people talked about, but shallowness of engagement in those. And we didn't really achieve consensus. But that's not necessarily a problem, even though the original Delphi is about achieving consensus. We were actually keen to yeah, to encourage a diversity of responses, which we certainly got. So I'll leave it at that, and we've still got a few minutes for discussion. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Farida. So maybe you can unshare your
Stop sharing.
Stop sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting presentations. I really enjoy it. I'm sorry I missed the first few parts because my computer just got crashed. So do we have questions now? Giselle, is that an applause or raise hand for a question? Okay, we have Sam here.
An applause, sorry.
Thanks, Giselle.
We have Sam. And then
yeah, I have a question relating to the method. So, I mean, I was wondering if you think you could extend the Delphi method to be used with just like ordinary people, because I imagine that a lot of the problems with like literacy and finding a diverse participant pool would be even greater. But like, I don't know, I was just thinking certain issues where it might be interesting to see if you can find consensus among people that doesn't appear if in like, okay, so the example that came to mind was like, if you ask people about what they think immigration should be like, and then they say, yada, 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 and then you pass that over to other people and they'll be like, I didn't even think of this point, but my opinion on it is this. Or do you think the method would probably not translate well to that sort of mass opinion?
Okay, yeah, no, I think it, I think that would be difficult. I think you would need to have participants who share something in common. So people from the, you know, some sort of organisation that shares something. I think what you're talking about, and this was related to this ethics discussion we were having recently. I like focus groups because focus groups as a method actually encourage disagreement. So they allow the kind of the thesis antithesis kind of structure of conversation. So first of all, it's a more normal type of conversation rather than co-constructing a document, which is a more kind of academic sort of thing anyway. And then with focus groups, yeah, you have somebody saying, yeah, I think immigration should be reduced because of these reasons, and then somebody else says, oh, but you know, our economy depends on it, and so you get this interesting kind of interaction.
I was just thinking that, like, potentially you could, I mean, yeah, potentially you could get things like anonymity in participants or splitting it up over time that are difficult with focus groups. That, just a thought.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. And, you know, as I said, that within this method, one of the criticisms of the method is that you lose the outlier responses. So the people that don't fit within that 75% or above who agree with a particular thing, they're just lost. Whereas in fact, you know, for a social scientist, this is kind of a much more kind of a medical research approach. For a social scientist, we're really interested in those people that don't share the same opinion. And we think that there might be something useful and interesting about those people. So you don't want to lose those. So maybe there's a way of modifying it so that you draw up a document that contains the range of opinions or attitudes or responses, and then people can kind of, you know, vote on that or something like that. It's an interesting idea to mess around with, I think, and very useful in a COVID environment where you can't, you know, if you don't want to do online stuff.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so now Malvern, and then after Malvern, I think I will read the questions on the chat box. Malvern.
Okay, thank you so much. I see that I'm the only LP. Just to introduce myself, my name is Malvern. I'm based at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. I'm a postdoc there at the Center for African Studies. So I've got an interest in this kind of area that you presented. So that's why I'm here today. But also, I just wanted to pick up on that question of method. And from my experience, migration teams is a personalized experience, and group, those kind of group interviews or focus group discussions, at times they tend to quiet down, or they tend to invade someone's privacy. So I was maybe recommending that maybe if you could also potentially think of a strategy of maybe having individual, I know we are in this period of COVID, but maybe trying to find ways of interviewing people individually as a way of getting as much more information as possible. And I don't know as well that if you, in your group, maybe you might have thought about this, maybe also just to increase the number of respondents, because I saw that you had quite a number from Ghana, and without including the experts, the technocrats. Also, migrants, from my experience, tend to group themselves, particularly in religious gatherings, churches, mosque, and etc. And that could be also a good starting point to get a number of people to just get feedback on, and then build up on that. So that is my first point. And my second question that I had was, transnationalism also it tends to come with a sense of belonging in both places, in Africa and in Australia. So my question that I just wanted to get a sense from you is how Africans in the diaspora feeling being Australians, how do they feel like they've particularly engaged or being embraced in Australia, so that they can term themselves as Australians enough? So are Africans in the diaspora seeing themselves as Australians, in as much as they view themselves as African, but have they embedded themselves into the Australian culture, politics, and are they able to really identify themselves as Australians? Because from my experience, I know that there are some people who maintain ties with places of origin, but there are some that actually cut ties with Africa and they want to view themselves as Australians. So in your case, did you come across those kind of people? Sorry, I spoke a lot. Thank you.
No, thanks, Melvin. That's great. And maybe we can have an email conversation, and I can suggest some literature, because there's a lot of research that has been done in relation to your last question about how and why it is that Africans in Australia, even if they want to become invisible and just be Australians, are not able to because of their visible difference, that they are constantly identified, constantly both interpersonally and institutionally identified as different. So there is a lot of literature about that already. There also is a lot of research that is small-scale research that has used an interview technique, etc., in the sort of way that you're describing, and it is, it's very effective. You're quite right. We did offer our participants that if they didn't want to contribute to the written document, that we could interview them. But nobody took us up on that. So and that again, it would have modified the technique, because then how would you integrate the transcript from an interview into this sort of written document? But it is an interesting method. But I'll send you. I'll look you up and I'll send you some suggestions for reading.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Marvin. Farida, we have a couple of questions on the chat board.
Yeah.
I'd like to read because it's quite long and connected. I see there are at least from 3 persons, Davida, Danau, and Greg.
Okay, sorry, I'm looking.
Wait.
Okay, so Davida, simple answer. The study is not quite finalized, so we're just incorporating those the round 2, and we're starting to write about it. So we're just writing a chapter for a book that's coming out by Melissa Phillips, an edited collection on diasporas and development. And so, yeah, so we're starting to write up the findings. In what way is the use of the term Black Africans addressed, discussed, since we don't, you're quite right, Danao. But until somebody gives me a better definition or a better way of referring to the not white Africans, because the white Africans literally assimilate rather than even integrating very quickly into Australian society. We've heard anecdotally that the 1.5 generation, the kids of white South African migrants change their accents really, really quickly. They learn how to do the Australian accent very much more quickly than other kids, and then they're just like others. Whereas for the Black Africans, it's a very different experience. So Graham Hugo went as far as to say that that white Africans would have one of the best migration experiences in Australia. Black Africans would have one of the worst migration and settlement experiences in Australia. So yeah, without getting into a discussion of race as a construct, that's the term that we use. Okay, of those who engage with home countries and diaspora organisations, mainly first generations. And there's this interesting thing that the first generation will often threaten, and in fact sometimes do, send their kids back home to Africa, even if they've come as humanitarian entrants, because of concerns around basically that they're integrating too well, that they're getting into drugs and alcohol and not studying and so on. So parents get very concerned about the influence of Australian culture on their young people, and may try to send their young people back, which is also an interesting transnational connection, which didn't come up much in this particular project. So we didn't get much information about second generation and their transnational engagements, apart from the fact that families will go back, take their kids back in a sort of a tourism kind of sort of experience, yeah. And then, sorry, there was a question by
Davida about educational experiences, and then from Greg on representativeness.
Don't you explore the educational experiences?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we didn't really talk about education in this particular. So there's a lot of research in Australia. There are researchers who are focusing on education, particularly. We know that there are a growing number of African students coming to study at tertiary institutions in Australia. We know that second generation Africans experience challenges within the educational system, but we know that only from studies that have been done with humanitarian entrants, so people of refugee backgrounds. So it's very difficult to make any generalizations about this population in terms of educational outcomes, etc., because we don't have much detail. Although Sarah, is Sarah here? No. Okay. So Sarah Prout-Quick, she has done some analysis of some of these demographic characteristics of the African diaspora in Australia. So she would be able to talk to us about educational outcomes, etc. But that's from Bureau of Statistics data rather than from this particular research project. And then Greg's question about the term African. Yeah. No, you're quite right. No, I don't really have a comment on that, but I agree. yeah, that we're using English as a language. Yeah, sure. And we did, we chose kind of Ghana and Kenya as countries to focus on, in the hope that we would have participants who would be able to engage in English, and we did get a number from each. I see Christina's got her hand up.
Christina, please.
Okay, hi Farida, that was very good, thank you. That was really good. I just heard 30 minutes before your talk on Twitter, so I just hopped on, and I told Giselle to hop on, so that was very good, in the nick of time. I was going to ask about Kenya, the Kenya and Ghana, why this choice and not others, but you just said it's because of language, is it?
Partly it was because of language. We thought they were interesting in terms of their profiles. We were interested in, well, they were, well, so there are a number of kind of pragmatic reasons. So one had to do with the countries that our university has like university to university relationships with. Okay, so that's kind of one of them. We also wanted to move away from the humanitarian entrant kind of populations. David had already a number of connections with people in these countries who he was working on other projects with. So yeah, there were a number of reasons. David, did you want to add anything on that one?
Sure. Hi. Yeah. Well, it started off very much because of the conditions of the grant that we applied for, which said that it's a research collaboration award that you need to pursue with existing networks. So that's kind of, it's not a really good reason for choosing those countries, but it was a pragmatic reason. And look, originally we had planned a workshop in at least one of those countries, which would have kind of added to the whole process, but that wasn't possible because of COVID. So yeah.
What I think it's interesting in Kenya that you do have a community, an Indian community.
Yeah.
And there are students here. So, again, you have to say Black Africans because they're not white South Africans, and you are not the Indians that the Commonwealth, British, yeah.
Yeah, this is, and in fact, I when I was reading through who our participants were, one of the four of Kenyan background, one is of South Asian descent. And so I mean, I wonder whether I should use non-white rather than black, but there are different, again, the experiences are different. Yeah,
they're totally different if they are of Indian background or Sri Lankan, completely different experience. So I think it's very important to say what they are, and even for but for Europeans, it's problematic. So because in Australia, well, the whiteness is different in different countries. So for Europeans, Southern Europeans are not that white as Northern Europeans. So, it's complicated.
It's shades. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So it's 3:11 now. I think we can still have one more question if you don't mind, Farida.
Yeah.
From Sam.
There's one more in the chat. How does the decline in diaspora engagement second generation compare with other non-European appearing migrants? Yeah, and I think there's all sorts of really interesting questions about second generation African migrants in Australia. And because they're a relatively new population, and I know that they've been here since, settlement, etc. But I think this will be a growing area of research focus, because it may be, there's a lot of migration research that shows that kind of, first generation migrants, it's all about kind of working to support their kids, and second generation, it's all about integrating. Third generation, it's all about finding their roots. So it'll be really interesting to track whether that occurs with the population here of African background. And yeah, we again from experience and from research, there are incredible stories of feelings of being targeted as a second generation African. The young people here feel very much as though they are not allowed just to be a normal young person, that they are seen, if they're walking with friends, they're seen as a gang. If they're in a shop, they're seen as potential shoplifters. And so they're constantly being reminded of a negative construction of who they are because of race. And so whether that then would kind of exclude them or, you know, make them feel as though they can't identify as Australian, would it push them back to an identification with Africa or countries of origin? And that's another interesting thing, that they tend less to identify with the country of origin that their parents did, but with the region of origin as African, and or with African American. So that's another kind of identifier that comes up. But this is again an area for future research.
Thank you, Farida. Thank you, everyone. I think let's give applause to Farida. Thumbs up. Great.
And thank you to my co-authors, co-researchers.
I do hope next semester we can learn about the other theme.
Yeah. Which is actually, you know, that's the stuff that I'm most interested in. So yeah, we'll do another one.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. I think that's all for today. See you next week. Next week we will have Apriwan. He is our PhD candidate, and next week he'll presenting his research. Okay, so thank you so much, and have a good rest of the week. Thank you.